tax law has on land and property owners, as well as the implication it has on boosting domestic revenue in Rwanda's quest to be a self-sufficient country. We are joined here, thank you very much for joining us, we are joined here from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning by Jonathan Nzeikodera, who is the Division Manager, Fiscal Decentralization. Thank you for honoring our invite.
Thank you too.
Great. My name is Dana Mpisi. I'm part of the Square. As always, I'm joined by my resident panelists. On my left, we have Ephraim Romwendye. Welcome to the Square.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, we're here with Charlie Haba.
Dana, how are you?
Good.
Yes.
So this is an interesting and a timely topic, I believe. And like we always do on the Square, just before we get into the subject, we're just going to have a brief midweek recap. And Ephraim, I'll start with you briefly. It's been an interesting week so far.
There are many highlights. I think I'll talk about the fact, because we've talked about it before in the Square, about the opening up of the 60% discount of the apartments in Vision City to civilians. I find it particularly interesting. We've talked about this before, that it missed the mark the first time because it didn't take into consideration that the government employees that they were targeting, especially in terms of rank, could not afford some of these mortgages. So it's interesting to see the turn of events.
Do you think you're eligible?
I think I am, actually.
Is it?
But
Good.
the question is not about whether I am, it's whether I will seek that opportunity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Charles?
No, I think in the interest of time, I just want to build on what Ephraim is saying and just mention only one thing. In as far as that discount is concerned, from the onset, they did not have to reduce the houses by an entire 60%. I rest my case.
Conversation for another
Yes.
another day on the Square. So, Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us on this very interesting and timely discussion on the new property tax law. And my first question to you and my resident panelists will also chip in, is to do with just understanding the rationale. And we are aware that this tax law was passed by Parliament in August, and it's also a revision of the law that started in 2017 December. And its rationale that we are aware of so far is to provide basic infrastructure and other services to citizens by district because of increased revenues, as always to promote efficient land use. But can you expound on this? And also, while you expound on it, if you can give us the level of consultations that were made also with the private sector.
Okay. Thank you, Diana and colleagues for inviting me to this, to give those who are following the Square, which is an important show I also personally follow, so I believe so many people are following up, and it's an important opportunity to explain to those who are following us on what is embedded in the new law. One clarification I want to make, there is no property tax law. Somehow it is a law establishing the source of income for decentralized entities. Why I'm making it maybe this, it's maybe those who want to search for the gazetted version to know the proper title of the law, but also it has so many other taxes and other source of income for decentralized entities. So it's a clarification I want to make. Property tax is one of the revenues for decentralized entities. When I come back to this property tax, maybe there is a reason why it is being called property tax law. The major reform is about the property tax, which we will talk about maybe this evening. When I talk of the rationale for the property tax law, there are like 3 or 4 major important policy objectives around this reform. One is, of course, mobilizing resources for decentralized entities. But for financing, the basic needs they need to give to citizens, including basic infrastructures. Decentralized entities are there to provide services to citizens, but the most important one, currently they are struggling, especially when it comes to infrastructures, because they are heavily relying on the central government transfers. With their self-sustainability, it's not working out. When we commissioned the study, one of the areas where there were potentials, there were some property tax as an area to tap in. And maybe quickly, let me touch on why maybe a direct correlation between infrastructures and the property tax and maybe benefit owners who pay that tax benefit. One thing, whenever the government avail any public infrastructure, a hospital, a road, something, the value of your property, be it land, being a house, its value changes without you changing it. So there is a direct benefit whenever the government invests in basic infrastructure through this tax. Now the question is maybe to look at around that one. The purpose, now government is raising more resources, but how about those who can be adversely affected? So many actually aspects have been thought about in this law, including the important one, exempting one residential house at least for every Rwandan. At least those who are following us should know, at least everyone is entitled to an exemption for one residential house irrespective of the value. Secondly, the majority of the land in rural areas, it's reserved for agriculture activities. A land below 2 hectares is also exempted from this tax. So a number of other incentives.
Because 2 hectares is
Yeah,
small? Or?
small.
Okay.
It's small.
It's small.
So then even above, each hectare above, it's a small amount, like 4,000 per hectare per year. So it's a relatively small amount to make sure that there are no other people who are adversely affected by this reform. A second policy objective is about maybe efficient land use. When we talk of efficient land use, there was actually a debate in the leadership retreat of 2015 where this issue came up, whereby now, as the country develops, there is a tendency that even the land earmarked for other activities, including agriculture, being used for construction. Okay, there are so many debates around it, but much as with the small surface of our country we know, if we continue doing the way we are building, there is a negative impact maybe for the generation to come. True. So this new law encourages maybe people to build vertically where there are special rates for those who build in apartments. Third element, people don't misuse maybe land or use it inefficiently, maybe they may not use in misuse. When there are even those who buy land and don't develop, maybe for speculation. Because there is maybe, I can hear tomorrow something will be developed in a certain location, you go there, you buy a certain land, then you don't develop. Implication it has. How about those citizens who were there, who are just maybe chased away? Sometimes they go and create slums somewhere, but when yourself you don't develop, there is a negative economic impact on the country. So those who also own undeveloped land, they are being actually sent a message in this law. You need to do something on your land. And the last one is promoting the commercial and maybe industrial building. For the commercial building, we've made some studies in other countries. In most countries, actually all of them, commercial and industrial buildings are taxed higher than the residential buildings. For us, it's a reverse way. Because we want to promote those commercial buildings and industrial ones so that in line with our made in Rwanda policy, at least our industries can be more competitive. So from all this combination of various policy objectives, the new property tax law has two components. A land tax, which is area-based, that you pay a certain amount per square meter based on actually what the land is used and the location. Then the second component...
On an annual basis?
Yes, on an annual basis. Then the second component is the building tax, which is a value-based kind of approach. It's a certain percentage of the market value of your building. I forgot another important maybe policy objective around this reform, which is about actually implementing the current law. There were so many inefficiencies, including even inequity in them. Currently, the way we are taxing the property tax is based on ownership regime. Now, if I have a freehold title, I was paying only the property tax. While those who are on a lease contract were paying what we call the land lease fee. Now, the implication or what we call inequity, two people with properties of the same market value were paying differently. And more about that, actually people were not having incentive to go and apply for their freehold titles. Because you go for the freehold title, then you fall into the tax bracket. So basically, this inefficiency all over the world, nowhere the property is taxed on ownership. It was only Rwanda whereby ownership was taken into consideration during the taxation. That one is removed. Whether you have a freehold title or that, it's actually, you have to pay that. And why maybe people did not even notice the property tax was there It is because only 2% were paying that tax. Because actually most of
2%
people...
of landowners across
No,
the
no,
country.
yeah, across the country, yes. The statistics you have, only 2% were actually having a freehold title. Others were not having some incentive to go for this because it brings them to the taxes. So that's briefly what I can say about the
It's
policy
very
objectives.
detailed, I think, in terms of time
Yeah.
and informative information.
Yeah.
Charles, Ephraim, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, I want to pick on two things, and I'm one of the few people. First of all, I think for purposes of emphasis, it's important that our viewers know that I'm in the real estate business. So, so I am fairly conversant with historical, current, and goings on. But you see, Jonathan raises something extremely important around ownership regimes. And sometimes it's important to break it down into very, very simple terms. When you talk about 2% of the Rwandans owning freehold title, actually it's not 2% of the Rwandans, it's 2% of all property, land and buildings being freehold. Now, it meant that only 2% of all the properties that were registered in Rwanda were paying tax.
Yes.
Can you imagine how much revenue this government has been losing out? But I'll take it a notch higher and tell you that the other 98% had leases on the land that they would improve and put buildings on top of it.
Then the lease expires.
And they would, but the lease continues being just for the land, irrespective of the improvement.
Exactly.
And they still get that lease for the land, take it to a bank, mortgage it,
Exactly.
and still pay only ground rent. So the huge, and I might be crucified after this show, the huge loss that the government was suffering had to come to a standstill. Yes,
to also
had to come to a
support
standstill.
what Charles
Yes,
is saying,
yes.
statistics show, and this was advisement under the International Monetary Fund, that we actually were doing, it was very low compared to the region and also globally speaking.
Not really wrong, but
addition-
wrong.
So
Yeah, it was totally wrong. But
complement
in addition to that, I'll take it a notch higher and say, do you know how much ground rent is in Rwanda? You would find that
What do you
somebody
mean by
has
ground rent?
so you pay an annual rent.
Yes, yes.
Because you lease, therefore you rent from government. The owner of the land is government, and therefore you have to pay rent.
Yes.
Now, you'd find, for argument's sake, here in Kachuru, where RBA is, if you have land the size of where RBA sits, you can find you're paying as little as 300,000 francs a year
Yes.
for such prime land.
Yes.
So,
So,
I wanted
the premise was right, and I think, Jonathan, it's extremely right that that government has woken up to say that no, we can get a little bit more. But just to play devil's advocate here,
But I want to
again,
play devil's advocate on behalf.
no, let me just finish this point before you finish, before you come in a frame. We are lucky that we'll work and live in a government that works. When we pay our taxes, we see where that money goes. Roads are done, hospitals are there, Mutual is there, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. I belong to so many groups, family, friends, and what have you, and we've been arguing so much about this thing. And I just realized one thing, that it is poor communication or lack of information that makes people think that the taxes have been increased.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ephraim?
So I want to play a devil's advocate in relation to the change of these ownership rights. You know, when you talk about the difference between a freehold title and the land
Leasehold.
leasehold, and I'm talking from a layman's perspective, from my little education about this stuff, is that at some point the lease expires. Yes? So that means that the ownership, or at least the rights to the land, are not in perpetuity. They're not forever.
I will just inform, I'll just educate you on that one.
Yes.
The only circumstance under which the lease would not be renewed is if you choose not to renew it.
So, but now my question,
Yes.
my question then comes in, because, you know, on average, you find in some countries, most of the leases are 99 years. Depending on the nature. For residential, 99. I know some countries they'll say if it's commercial, it's 50. But then the question I have is, don't we see an implication where we are creating this, we're fostering, by changing these rights, instead of addressing the aspect of the lease fees and ensuring that the government can collect more on leasehold land, instead we're creating a situation where it becomes a situation where there's a generational, how can I describe it? There's a generational aspect to land ownership. Instead of creating this sense of equity, just because you were born at this particular time, at this particular period, and your parent or yourself, you're able to get a freehold title, that it's in your family for perpetuity. And that's, for me, is the question I'm asking. Aren't we necessarily looking at a short-term benefit of taxes versus a long-term aspect of creating some sort of equity in our economy for asset ownership?
So, Ephraim,
but can you let Jonathan let him answer that from an expert
he answers it from a very technical perspective, but I want to answer it in a very practical perspective. Yes, Ephraim, it is everybody's right to own freehold, especially Rwandese.
Definitely.
Everybody's right.
But is there enough
Even
to go
you.
around?
Yeah, no, you can wake up today,
Charles,
Ephraim, for the house that you own in Chimirongo that has been on lease, and apply for a freehold, and you will get your freehold.
Okay, Charles and Ephraim.
Yes.
First of all, our guest is here, and I know Charles, whenever it comes to real estate or housing, he takes over. No, thanks for your inputs. I'd just like the guest to get back in answering Ephraim's question.
Yes.
But before we do, again, for the sake of our audiences, I want us to really be, we're speaking to the lay people.
Exactly.
Can you just briefly clarify land lease? You know, when you have land and it's what you just spoke about, freehold and leaseholding, the difference between the two.
Actually, for the benefits of those who are the audience, let me put it actually in simple practical terms.
Exactly.
What does the owner of the freehold get or cannot get vis-a-vis the one who has? Actually, in simple terms, one is a step before another, especially for one, like Chase has said. Nothing stops you. For example, if it is a residential land, it is for you to have the freehold. You first have to have constructed that land, you get occupation permit, then you apply for this. There is just a certain process, you get that one. But then in practical terms, let us see if the owners of the land lease are not getting some rights which the owners of the freehold are not getting, or maybe are having. For example, you use the mortgage. You take your land lease title to the bank, whether it has 22 years or 99. Assume your point, maybe it is close to expired. What happens? Does your maybe land or other improvements have maybe some wheels to move? In any case, the land will be to you. The government will actually renew. That's why even the banks have never considered telling me if there is a single case whereby the bank has refused. Now I can sue. Your land lease contract is expiring. Therefore, I'm not taking this as a collateral. This has never happened. So actually, this encourages people to go and apply for their freehold title. So your question about the generation, actually, this imbalance between the people who are enjoying the rights, but when it comes to tax obligation, they run away from it. We are bringing some equity element.
I want to just tap on what you said about people being adversely affected by this law. And I wanted to talk, to just basically ask you a question in simple terms. Most people who had land were probably middle income citizens. So what happens to them when they have these parcels of land or plots of land, so to speak, and failure to develop these pieces of land in the required period happens and they can't pay the tax? What happens to these people?
By the way,
what is the punitive measure, so to speak?
By the way, before the land, maybe this property tax come in, these contracts we get with the government, on the back of them, there is a certain period where you have to use the land for the purpose you've acquired for.
So let me just give you an example to simplify it. Imagine, and you can weigh in here, Charles, as the real estate expert. I have a piece of land, and let's say my worth is, I don't know, 50 million, for instance. And I acquired this land and finalized the acquiring of this land in, let's say, 2016. let's say next year, 2019, in June, I have just barricaded it, I've just set a perimeter. I have not built on it based on the permit that I got to, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, I've not yet done that. But every end of year, on an annual basis, I have to pay this property tax. So number one, I failed to develop it because maybe I don't have the money in this required time. And then on top of failing to develop it, I also am unable to pay that tax on an annual basis. What happens to me and other people in this situation
Okay.
based on this new law?
First of all, I'm not encouraging those to have land and not develop it. It has other implication even
Like
on
you mentioned.
themselves. But what happens to them should any circumstance actually make this happen? The law has provided actually various measures. One, assume at the end of that year you are financially in difficulties that you cannot pay. You request to the local authorities, that is the council of that particular location where your land is, and you tell them, I'm having some issues for paying.
Okay.
You ask for deferring that tax liability, maybe to a certain period where you believe, or you ask for a waiver. Should you believe you have a reason to request for
And
that
this can be
waiver?
granted.
It is. Then it's in the council to assess what are your reasons for application, and then they can answer, provided you've requested that before the deadline for paying that. So, in any case, should you face some maybe situation under your beyond your control of not meeting your tax obligation, you request that one. There is some treatment they make for you, or you ask to pay in installments.
I want to say one of the positive things that that is coming out of this law and relate it to the ownership regimes. A leasehold and a freehold, I'll just liken it to somebody who owns a car, another person who rents a car. If you have a lease on your land, you're only a tenant on that property.
Because it's owned by government.
Yes.
This is the clarification. I was
Yes,
looking
you're
for.
only a tenant on that property.
Yes.
But if you have freehold, you fully own
On
that property.
Exactly.
Now, it is foolhardy of anybody to remain a tenant, yet the government gives you full rights. The law gives you full rights to wholly own that property.
So
That is number one. So with the exception of foreigners, and maybe the usage of the land, if it's
Yeah,
agricultural
yes.
or
A protected
yes,
area,
or
like
protected
a park,
area, yes,
kind
yes,
of.
yes. With the exception of those ones, if you're a Rwandan national or you're a Rwandan business with at least 50% shareholding of a Rwandan national, there is no reason whatsoever, if you have property that is developed, there is no reason why you should be a tenant of your own property.
now let me explain
Yes.
to you why I've brought up my issues. You know what's happening in South Africa around land? Do you know what's happening in
Yes.
South Africa? Where you have, this is historically black-owned land that was confiscated somehow
apartheid.
through apartheid. Actually, it was way before apartheid.
Colonial.
Through colonial powers
And
and the
without
colonial structures.
compensation.
I'm coming to the point. So now what ended up happening is that when the apartheid government came into power, they implemented this freehold regime in terms of ownership of rights. So you find that a lot of the current landowners inherited this land from their parents. Now what's happening is now, the question is, how do you, because this land is not owned by government, how do you then rightfully give this land back to the people it was taken from in the first place? Because these people have freehold titles. Now I'm bringing this up because on a simple basis, right? Charles, everybody has a right to own property. So, for example, let's say you and I, we decide and we go get freehold titles for the houses we're living in. And then, unfortunately, God forbid, one of our parents passes on, or our parents pass on. They had their own freehold title and they had a house. It's passed on to me, I inherit it.
Yes.
Now the question then comes in is that, aren't we creating a situation where we are creating a certain level of inequality that favors the elite, instead of us creating an environment where at some point the government can, if they realize that, let's say the assets are being held by a few, or
They
held
can
by a
reform-
certain, they can come in
reform
quickly and say, okay,
Yes.
let's redistribute this in this manner. And that's what I'm asking. I'm like, aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot, looking at taxes only, and not understanding that in 50 years or 60 years' time that this might actually have an implication. Because of course,
and this
considering
goes back to what you're saying about generational ownership of assets.
Yes.
I think this is what your question is. We are looking right now at widening the tax base, but 50 years from now, land in this country, based on what
We are
Okoye is
we're one of the highly
is going
densely
to be
populated
is going to be
nations in the
owned
country.
mostly by government and the elite because of that generational continuation of asset ownership.
I think I will
what do you have to say to that?
I will come back to maybe to what this law is collecting about the issues of land management.
Yes.
There should be a huge debate, and I'm actually I'm not on your side about the element you mentioned. But
So
let
you're
me
here.
stick to the tax.
Yeah.
Whether this tax is there or that, issues of land management, if they were there, that problem you are saying, it was still there. What we are saying,
That's true.
you shouldn't pay your tax based on that ownership regime, because actually people with properties of the same value, of the same rights and obligations, have to pay equally. That's what I'm
Agreed.
saying.
And we agree on
and
that.
then land management issues, maybe they are there, maybe they are not there. Let's address it another way. But in terms of the taxation, I don't see how this is creating the problem you are saying.
I would say, well, I think we're in agreement on that.
But
I
just quickly
do-
before we go for the break.
Yes, I think we're in agreement with that. I do believe we need to widen the tax base. But I'm saying that the way we are going about it is creating a problem for ourselves in the future that we have not foreseen. That for me is my...
I just want to put two particular things in context. One, by virtue of the fact that this is going to be managed, these are local government entities, they are decentralized entities.
Yes, yes.
So by virtue of the fact that it's going to be dropped down to district, sector, cell, village, means that it will address the issue of those inequalities, because the person in Gasa Arenda is not going to be treated the same way as the person in Kachiro.
Yeah.
They have different peculiarities. So that should allay your fears on one extent. But I want to emphasize, Ephraim, that the acquisition of freehold rights is a process.
Yes.
You first get a lease, you develop that land, and once the authorities come and see that you develop that land in accordance with the permit or
permit
the
you applied
construction
for.
permit and blah, 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 then they can give you your freehold rights. So yes, but however, that's it. And this is something I think, Jonathan, when you go back to your offices, you need to correct. There are historical errors that were made, where even in Kigali and other urban settings, you have people with freehold on undeveloped land. There's quite a number of cases there, and I think that really needs to be to be addressed,
That's a point
because
of
that will really
It will allay Ephraim's concerns.
allay Ephraim's
To a certain
concern.
degree.
Definitely. Well,
Yes,
we're going
yes.
to the break. We're going for a brief break, but we'll be back on this very interesting topic. Please stay tuned. We're here discussing the new property tax law, but I will come back and actually say it properly, like you corrected us. It's not the new property tax law. But we'll be back after the break. Please stay tuned. We are here on the square tonight discussing the new property tax law, and we are joined by Jonathan Nzai-Korera from Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. My last question, before we go to our social media feed on Twitter.
Oh, it's now the
is
last.
yes, the last. Unfortunately, I can see you enjoying yourself.
Before we start.
We've run out of time. This is to do, some of the key reasons, the rationale for this on policy objective, of course, was to boost domestic revenue and widen the tax base. So my question to you is if you can give us, just very briefly, short-term and long-term projections of this property tax law in that regard.
I think it is difficult to give maybe some projection in terms of numerical terms. Why this? Most of the properties who are coming on the tax base now, they need to be valued first. I would say there will be an exercise to know how much is the value of all these properties that are coming in on board. But we've done on a sample basis. I would say maybe currently between 4 to 5 times this is what we are projecting in terms of the revenue collections. Maybe let me avoid to give a certain figure to confuse people, but I would put it in that way. Okay. If we were taking maybe, like, let's say 1 kilometer of an asphalt road is taking maybe $1 million, just an example. So for us, the revenues were allowing us maybe a certain municipality to do maybe 10 kilometers every year. Because the revenues are expected to be like increased by 5 times, maybe we can be doing 50 kilometers instead of 10. So that's that way. But we have to do the valuation of all the properties. These are the projections. There are some who fall under exemption. There are a number of issues that I cannot say that we have an exact figure of what we expect.
And valuations have been going on so far.
Okay, the law is based on the self-assessment. It's the owner himself to go and declare what is the value for his property. But the tax administration authority has the right to accept or not accept. Assume, let's say, I've bought my house at 50 million. You are actually free to go and say, my building is worth 50 million. Then from that one, they take that value. Should they doubt that value, they commission their counter valuation at their cost. When the difference is actually less than 20%, let's say they find it's maybe 60 million, your value still holds. But when the difference goes beyond 20%, now the new value from the tax authority is the one to be the best.
Is there ever a situation where the value is below? So if somebody overstated the value of the asset, do they revise that? Or
well,
they
even
say
currently, the practice, sometimes maybe for those who are, but some people, there is maybe a perception when I go for a mortgage. Some people maybe say a higher value than the real
For
value.
insurance purposes.
Maybe for insurance purposes. But when it comes to taxation, you give a different value. I'm telling you those. Now we shall be synchronizing information with banks, with others. Should you have declared a higher value at a certain level? So there are a number, it can happen. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's something that can happen.
Can we
You
go
know,
to...
Dan, I just
yes.
wanted, you see, Jonathan raises something extremely important around the purpose for which the tax base is being widened and these revenues are being collected. This is for purposes of increasing the revenues that are going to these decentralized entities. My direct question is, for instance, let me take a district like Ramagana.
yes,
If the money is being collected by Ramagana, shouldn't Ramagana be at liberty to decide what they use their money for? And I'll take it a notch higher. If I stay in Rebero
Actually,
or
Charles,
Nyanza,
that's
yes.
how it is even currently. It's the local council that approves its district budget. They are the one, they have the full right. The difference actually this law is bringing in, before, like over 90% was coming from actually the central government, where the budget is approved by the parliament.
Yes.
Now we are reversing the picture. Now they have a bigger say on the big chunk.
A bigger say or an entire say? An entire say. So you're not going to go back to Gasab and Nyarujende and say you're collecting more money, let's have a bit of it
After
to...
now the
yes.
citizens have to request actually their rights. Now we are paying our property, you have revenues, implement what you want.
Can we go to a social feed? And our first tweet for this evening is from someone called BG. And what BG is telling us is, and you can weigh in on this tweet from BG. BG is saying, I would like to think that this property tax law will help have idle or unutilized land we see across the country. So I think this person is echoing what you are saying.
I want to disagree with this, you know, and people need to understand. I hate the word speculation with a passion. And you tax people and you government people need to understand that investments come in different forms.
Yes.
Including investment on land.
Yes.
If I decide to invest to buy land, it's not necessarily that I am speculating. It is, it's not necessarily that I am speculating. It's because I am anticipating a gain. It's the same way that I will go to a supermarket or a wholesaler, I'll take the sugarman's example, and bring in 2 tons of sugar and weight and on sell them at X amount per kilo. So do not penalize investors. And that's my biggest issue.
We are not penalizing.
Yes.
We are saying you, because you decide to make that investment, then pay the cost for that investment.
But won't that inflate? And I know there was a question around rental income. But aren't we? Because you know taxes. What happens with business people?
Yes.
You implement taxes on a businessman, he will then transfer those over to the final consumer. Aren't we creating a certain level of inflation within the property sector?
You see, the market actually it is built on a number of factors, including the one you are saying. The level of demand of now those actually housing is another element to put into consideration. Now on the other side, you've talked about the 60% discount on affordable housing. You see, there are
not affordable.
Maybe they have become affordable. Now there are higher chances. Now the people who are renting are going to those. So should we decide to increase the rent, what happens to the demand? Maybe some people change their mind and think of their own houses. So it's a combination of various factors that a simple factor cannot actually affect the inflation.
But does that, one of the factors, does it include income rising?
Of course, anything that happens in the market affects the demand and supply. It's obvious.
Just very quickly, our next tweet is also again from BG, and BG's tweet is talking about, he says, Rwandans are paying little taxes compared to other EAC countries. The only difference here, many people pay taxes, and in our neighbors, few do pay taxes. Reasons for outcry. So this person is actually saying that, and Charles, this echoes, I think, what you were saying earlier on, we pay little taxes, and this is why this property tax, this law was enacted to widen the tax base and increase revenues.
Yeah, this is. I think this is really right. It's the efficiency, and I'm sure that's where the biggest outcry is coming from, because the efficiency of Rwanda Revenue Authority compared to other tax administration bodies in many other countries, ours is they're extremely alert. So I know that's where this is all coming from, because every penny will be collected. But yes,
to add on, Charles, before maybe you add on, also the value for the taxes, every penny you pay,
absolutely
is there
right.
a value? I think that is something we should be proud of.
Yes,
so
extremely proud.
I think this is another comparison you need to make.
Our last tweet, and this it's a bit technical, so I'd like you to answer that, Jonathan. And this last tweet is from someone who says that, and this is directly quoting the law and the specific article. Maurice says that according to this article, a property worth 400 million is the same as one worth 5 million, would be paying immovable property tax as long as both are occupied by their owners.
Yes, it is.
So,
in other words, every Rwandan is entitled to actually one house considered as his own residence, whether it is 400 or even $1 billion. Yes.
Okay. Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think the whole rationale of not penalizing first home owners is extremely important. That is music to our ears. But I want to talk about something around the importance of ensuring that everything is in place before we rush to collect more money. And I'll give you a practical example. The new law on property tax or fixed assets, I think whatever its detailed acronym is, talks about encouraging high-rise building and people in apartments. Whilst we still
As
have...
I think they know it's 50% of the effective tax rate of others would be paying.
Yes, correct.
Those who follow us should know that. If you build on an apartment of 4 levels and above, you pay 50% of another person would pay.
Yes, yes. Which is extremely commendable.
Yes, yes.
However, we still have significant gaps in the condominium law, whereby its implementation and actual issuance of condominium titles is still a huge walk to trek. So my message is, and Jonathan, you mentioned earlier on that you follow the Square quite a lot.
Yes, yes.
We like talking about institutional coordination. We have rushed to tell people, come and build apartments, whilst we are not ready from a legal perspective to actually have people have their condominium titles.
And while on that,
Yes.
And this is our last tweet, and I think it ties in also to do, I hope this is something we're ready for. This last tweet is from someone who's asking, he's called Miniga, and he says, his question is, thank you, the Square, for a very informative discussion, but his question is, are freehold titles that were issued before 1994 still valid today, or the new Land Center issued papers nullified them?
I'm not sure what or why shouldn't they be valid.
I think I'm fairly conversant with this. There was a land registration exercise and a mapping exercise that was done. And the mapping exercise, they did physical plans and there were aerial maps that were taken. Now, there were errors because not all that was on ground was captured by what was taken by the aerial photographs of what was there. Now, of recent, that has been merged because they took the aerial pictures and went physically to actually verify. Now, everyone who had freehold titles, all they needed to do was take the land registration number to the land center or the bureau at the sector level or whoever was in charge, and they would immediately get a freehold title. Yes.
While we're on the topic of freehold title, this is our last tweet for the night, and this particular tweet is asking for a slight elaboration on this. He says, this is Vincent Mugabo, who says, can we elaborate more on the requirements to get freehold titles? Also, what are the figures involved in the new tax law? I think in the interest of time, we won't answer both questions, but again, this comes to the freehold requirements and
there is a number of conditions, and it depends on actual.
Can summarize it for
So, for example, the residential may be one of them. You need to have rented actually your land. You need to have paid land lease regularly. Then, if it is actually for residence, you should have constructed it. You get occupation permit, and then from that one, there is a process. So, it's a number of procedures you have to follow that maybe I could indicate him from any website.
Which institution did they go to?
It's the municipality, local government,
Okay.
actually. Any website, the one-stop center, they provide.
I think also this information is available in the Rwanda Revenue Authority website.
And don't traumatize them. It's not a difficult process. It's a very easy process.
But the information is out there.
It's there.
Okay, so I think we should be looking at these institutions and the websites that offer this information. We're coming to the end of our show, and I would like us to give closing remarks on this topic. It's very informative, but very dynamic, and we might have to have a part 2 of this, especially in terms of informing our public on it. From a policy perspective, it's very interesting and also very valid points in terms of the journey this country is making. Charles, I'll start with you on brief closing remarks.
Yes, briefly. My closing remarks are really around the work that Jonathan and your colleagues whom you work with, whether at lands or communication or municipalities or different entities, the work that you need to do in terms of communication. The word on the streets is that property taxes have increased to a level that they are no longer affordable, whereas that is not the case.
It is not.
And it's also being implemented progressively.
Now, even the implementation is progressive. How many people know these things? So there's a lot of work that you guys need to do, and I'm glad that, well, the Square is very elitist. It might just be one tip of the iceberg, but there's really quite a lot of work that you guys need to do, and I hope My hope was that you could have given yourselves one more year, because I realized that 31st of March 2019, people will have started paying according to the new regime.
The deadline has moved
deadline.
to December. That will be
2019.
December 2019.
Fantastic.
Okay.
So this is information that
yes.
needs to be constantly, I
Yes,
think,
yes,
shared
yes.
with the public.
Yeah.
Ephraim?
Yeah.
I think, I feel like I'm going to talk about the things I've been talking about from the beginning of the show. I think the idea of increasing the tax base is a must. Again, giving our districts that authority and giving them the financial capacity to carry out some of the work that they need to do is absolutely critical. We need feeder roads, we need better drainage systems, we need power grid upgrade. There are so many things that can be done, and when you miniaturize them and decentralize it, it increases efficiency and actually improves the implementation strategy. But I still believe that beyond that, the way we are going about it, I feel like has not taken into consideration things around land that are possibly 50 years in the future. And I think, because again, we are one of the highly densely populated nations in the world, meaning that land is not as available or to everyone as we would like. So we need to be a bit more cautious and a bit more strategic with what we decide as our strategy in trying to increase our tax base.
And also looking long term. Long term, you're talking 6 decades, 7 decades from decisions that are being made today.
100, because these are things that
100, yeah.
these are things that as our country grows and now as our systems become more robust, you need strong foundations, and this is a foundational. This is a foundational thing. This is something that we can't just wake up after 20 years and say, let's change it. Because there'll be so many things we'll have to change. It now becomes preventative rather than, it becomes a cure rather than a prevention. Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, I take the recommended points by Charles and maybe Ephraim for being aggressive in terms of informing the public on what it is about. Secondly, people shouldn't be scared of this. We have a government that works for its people. It is considered their concerns, most of them, they are actually addressing the law. Only that maybe they need to be explained. Most of the concerns, this law has taken 3 years during the elaboration and approval process. So all the 3 years we're discussing so many issues that I believe that's the best we can get, and the concerns are being addressed. So we are going to continue explaining to the public through various channels. We thank Square for this opportunity. We hope part 2 is coming
yes.
back soon.
Definitely.
Lastly, is actually there is a value for this. Let's support this country. This is our country. Yeah. Its development lies on us. So we are the one to take it forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd just like to reiterate, we had a show here. You remember the income tax law and the increase. There was also a lot of public reaction saying, but why are we widening the tax base? Is the tax base a reflection of, a real reflection of taxpayers in this country? But the long term of it is to do with the fact that we are really on a journey of self-sufficiency.
Yes.
It's going to be a bit difficult in the beginning, but the ideal is that we want to move as a country and to get to our vision, basically. So it's very interesting to hear that. We've come to the end of our show. Thank you very much for joining us. We're here talking about the new property tax law. There's probably going to be part 2 of it, as government also works hard to inform the public on the rationale, the reasons, and the projections and the impact in terms of development and self-sufficiency as a country. Please keep the conversation going using our Twitter hashtag, #TheSquareRW, and also keep the conversation going, writing to us on our social media platforms. Thank you very much. I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank our partners, Uzi Collections, as well as Bourbon Coffee. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.